This wealthy young woman was named Junhee. She had just become pregnant when her boyfriend died unexpectedly. Her father, Woljin, out of concern for his daughter and the family's reputation, found a poor young man named Taejun to take her place. Taejun, who was eager to improve his family's circumstances, agreed readily. Looking at the beautiful wealthy woman before him, he swore that he would never tell his family, and that he would never regret his decision. He then took Junhee home. His mother was very pleased with this daughter-in-law. Looking at her slightly rounded belly, she hoped her daughter-in-law would give birth to a boy. Only then could the family line continue. Hearing her mother-in-law's words, the girl felt deeply guilty. On the way home, Junhee said she would never have children again. If he regretted his decision, it was still not too late. However, Taejun gently took her hand. He said he was the biological father of the child in her womb. For Junhee and the child in her womb, he would agree to anything she asked of him. Looking at the emotionless man before her, Junhee pulled her hand away and turned to leave. Woljin also placed great importance on his bloodline. He decided to have his daughter undergo a caesarean section, and had a feng shui master provide a birth chart with an imperial destiny. He believed his grandson would become a future business tycoon. However, Taejun was secretly plotting an astonishing plan, because he refused to accept his fate as an insignificant son-in-law. 27 years passed in the blink of an eye. Woljin built the Yangdi Group, worth trillions of dollars. The once poor Taejun had become the group's vice-chairman. He kept his promise and did not have any more children with Junhee. The family doted on their eldest grandson, Kuanhu. His grandfather and father worked hard to groom him as the heir to the family conglomerate. However, Kuanhu, who had been spoiled since childhood, was rebellious. He had no interest in marrying into a wealthy family. Instead, he fell for Siwoo, a poor secretary at the company. He disregarded his father's scolding and the employees' gossip and pursued Siwoo relentlessly. Even though Siwoo already had a boyfriend, he didn't care. He didn't know that Siwoo and her boyfriend, Yuchel, had already met. Yuchel was the company's new accountant. Although he had only been at the company for a short time, he discovered the company's secret of falsifying accounts to secure loans. He realized that the company was facing a financial crisis. Woljin was deeply disappointed in his grandson, so he called a feng shui master to his home. He asked the master if his grandson was truly destined to be an emperor. The feng shui master told the chairman not to worry. He said that once Kuanhu met his destined partner and had children, he would surely ascend to the throne smoothly. However, what Woljin never imagined was that his grandson had been swapped at birth by Taejun. Kuanhu was not biologically related to him. The story flashes back 20 years. Woljin's real grandson, Yuchel, was still living in an orphanage. After finally being adopted, he had to endure the abuse of his adoptive father. To escape his adoptive father's pursuit, he jumped off the roof. Fortunately, a kind sister named Siwoo took care of him at the orphanage. 20 years later, the two developed a romantic relationship. The pain of his childhood left deep scars on Yuchel's forehead. After graduating, the two of them got jobs at the same company. Siwoo was the company's secretary. He was a new accountant at the company. But at that time, he didn't know that he was the true heir of the family. A conspiracy changed his fate. He soon discovered financial irregularities at the company. In order to raise funds from banks and individuals, the company had falsified its financial data. Some people who held company bonds were unable to cash them in and ultimately chose to end their lives in protest. To prevent more people from being deceived, he decided to expose the company's secrets with his colleagues. However, their actions were discovered by the company's vice-chairman, Taejun. Taejun immediately ordered Yuchel's arrest. Fortunately, with Siwoo's help, Yuchel narrowly escaped. What Yuchel didn't expect was, Taejun had already seen his records. Looking at Yuchel's birthday and the orphanage where he grew up, Taejun began to suspect his true identity. He suspected that Yuchel was the true heir to the family. Looking at his own son, who was so weak, he feared that Kuanhu's true identity would be exposed. He hurriedly found his son's biological mother, Miran, and confided his suspicions to her. Miran recounted Yuchel's upbringing. Taejun grew increasingly anxious. He believed Yuchel must have discovered his true identity, and now he had come to seek revenge. Miran also regretted her actions from the past. Taejun threatened Miran that if the truth about the baby swap were to come out, he would never forgive her. That night, upon returning home, he looked at his son. He couldn't let Kuanhu's true identity be exposed. He had already decided to kill Yuchel. The next day, he went to his father-in-law to discuss the matter. To prevent the company's financial issues from being exposed, Woljin also entrusted the matter to his son-in-law. He didn't know that the person he wanted to eliminate was his own grandson. That day, Yuchel was listening to music and enjoying the scenery by the river. He didn't know that danger was approaching silently. Under Taechun's secret plan, his car was crashed off a cliff. Siwoo, who was unaware of this, was still waiting for him to come home. It wasn't until the next day that Siwoo saw the news about Yuchel's car accident in the newspaper. The police said that due to 2 days of heavy rain, the search and rescue operation couldn't be carried out. Although Yuchel's body hadn't been found, the chances of him surviving were almost zero. Yuchel's colleagues also rushed to the police station. He believed that Yuchel's death was not an accident but was related to Yangdi Group. Siwoo also began to suspect Yangdi Group. After hearing this, she then rushed to the group headquarters under the guise of a secretary. In Taechun's office, she also found Yuchel's files. This further deepened her suspicion of Taejun. At that moment, Taejun was reporting the situation to his father-in-law. Woljin merely expressed regret upon hearing the news. Little did he know that Yuchel was his own grandson. Taejun secretly rejoiced. He had finally eliminated his father-in-law's true grandson. He was determined to make his own son the heir to the family. However, what he didn't expect was that Miran had also seen the news about Yuchel's accident. She knew that Taejun must have done it, so she rushed to Yangdi Group. Her conversation with Taejun was overheard by Siwoo. From their conversation, Siwoo finally learned her boyfriend's true identity. She also finally learned the real cause of her boyfriend's death. After returning home, she stroked Yuchel's clothes. Recalling the time she spent with Yuchel, Siwoo couldn't help but cry sadly. She decided to avenge Yuchel and then end her own life. However, to her surprise, Yuchel wasn't dead. That day, Siwoo carefully poured poison into a coffee cup. She wanted to die with the person who killed her boyfriend. However, at that moment, she suddenly felt nauseous. She hurriedly looked at the calendar next to her. She suddenly realized that her period was late. She hoped that she wasn't pregnant, but the pregnancy test showed that she was. At that moment, Siwoo was very hesitant. She wanted to take revenge and go to heaven to find her boyfriend, but she also wanted to carry on her boyfriend's bloodline. So she thought of the person who stole her boyfriend's identity. Then she came up with a perfect plan for revenge. She wanted to deceive Kuanhu into believing he was the father of her unborn child, and have the child reclaim the property that belonged to her boyfriend. She then called Kuanhu. Upon receiving Siwoo's call, Kuanhu was very excited. He never expected the person he liked would contact him first. When they met, Siwoo said she wanted to go abroad on a business trip with him, and use this opportunity to get closer to him. Upon hearing this, Kuanhu pulled her into his arms. At that moment, Siwoo was only thinking about getting revenge for her boyfriend. This was only the first step of her revenge plan. However, her boyfriend had already regained consciousness in the hospital. A stranger had saved him. In the days that followed, Yuchel called Siwoo every day, but her phone was always turned off. Yuchel was worried that his girlfriend had been implicated in his case, so he called his colleague to the hospital. The colleague said that Siwoo had gone abroad on a business trip recently. After hearing this, Yuchel finally felt relieved. However, the colleague angrily said that Kuanhu had also gone abroad with Siwoo. He believed that Siwoo had probably gone on a honeymoon. Siwoo must have been thinking of marrying into a wealthy family. However, Yuchel didn't believe it. He felt that there must be some misunderstanding. He then begged his colleague not to reveal that he was still alive, worried that Yuchel would be hurt again. His colleague readily agreed. However, Yuchel didn't know that the woman who saved her had developed feelings for him, and that woman was Kuanhu's half-sister, Rona. When Woljin found out that Kuanhu was with his secretary, he strongly opposed it. Kuanhu had no choice but to reveal that Siwoo was pregnant. Upon hearing his son's words, Taejun scolded him for being useless. After saying that, he left angrily. Kuanhu could only plead with his grandfather. However, his grandfather also cursed his grandson for being good for nothing. Kuanhu then angrily questioned his father why he couldn't be with Siwoo. His father brought up the connections of the wealthy family. He said that if the two wealthy families were to become in-laws, Kuanhu would definitely become a tycoon in the business world. However, Kuanhu said that they were different. Taejun was not his biological father. Upon hearing his son's words, Taejun was stunned, because Kuanhu was indeed his biological son. However, Kuanhu had no idea. Taejun was deeply heartbroken. Junhee watched her grieving husband from outside the door. She felt immense gratitude toward Taejun. She believed that Taejun had always treated Kuanhu as his own son over the years. He must have endured countless hardships during that time. However, she was unaware that her own son had been swapped at birth by Taejun. The son she had always doted on had no blood relation to her. She now deeply regretted taking her son to his biological father's grave to pay respects. She regretted revealing the truth about Taejun and her son having no blood relation. Junhee then tried to persuade her own son. She said it was all her fault. However, Kuanhu insisted on marrying Siwoo. He said he didn't want to live with someone he didn't love, just like his mother. After hearing her son's words, Junhee decided to go persuade her husband and father. The next day, she went to the company to find her husband. She said that her father would appoint him as the company chairman. The condition was that her son must marry Siwoo. She said that the only person who could lead Yangdi Group now was her husband. The only person who could save her son was Siwoo. After hearing his wife's words, Taejun also agreed readily. Woljin also called the feng shui master to the house again. The feng shui master said that Kuanhu and Siwoo were very compatible. If the two could marry smoothly, Kuanhu would surely ascend to the throne smoothly, and Siwoo was an indispensable person in Kuanhu's life. At this point, Woljin also began to hesitate. That evening, Junghee also found her father. She hoped her son could be with the person he loved. After hearing her daughter's words, Woljin agreed readily. Junghee then asked her father to pass the chairman's position to Taejoon. However, Woljin firmly refused. He said he couldn't hand over the company to an outsider with no blood relation. Junghee said her father was still the largest shareholder in the company, and that her husband was past the age of having children, so the company would still go to her son. After hearing her daughter's words, Woljin reluctantly agreed. Now Siwoo was finally ready to marry into a wealthy family. She was already pregnant. Kuanhu gently stroked her belly, but Siwoo pushed his hand away. Looking at the man who deeply loved her, Siwoo felt bitter inside. The two then went to Kuanhu's luxurious villa. The butler bowed to the future young mistress. Her grandfather also made a promise he would throw Siwoo the most extravagant wedding. He also gave orders to the group's private hospital. He wanted his great-grandson to be born healthy. After the prenatal checkup, Siwoo's father-in-law, Taejoon, found her. He said that his son would inherit the family company. His grandson would also become a tycoon in the business world. However, he didn't know that the child in Siwoo's womb wasn't biologically related to him. All of this was just Siwoo's plan to avenge her boyfriend. But Yuchel wasn't actually dead. He also saw the news about Siwoo's wedding in the newspaper. He never imagined that his girlfriend would abandon him like this. He immediately rushed to the wedding venue. He had imagined countless times what his girlfriend would look like in a wedding dress. However, the groom standing beside his girlfriend was not him. When he saw the huge diamond ring on his girlfriend's hand, the flames of revenge began to burn in Yuchel's heart. After Yuchel left, he recalled all the strange things his girlfriend had done, and the expression on her face when she saw him. He felt that all of this was his girlfriend's premeditated plan. At that moment, Siwoo had already betrayed him. He was heartbroken. In the days that followed, Yuchel, unable to reveal his real name, could only hide in a rented apartment belonging to a friend. Looking at his haggard reflection in the mirror, he felt that he must take revenge. He couldn't just give up like this. However, as soon as he stepped out to look for a job, he encountered an elderly man being robbed. Without hesitation, he rescued the elderly man. But at that moment, he had no idea that the elderly man was a wealthy tycoon. The elderly man was about to change his destiny. Soon after, Siwoo's wife was about to give birth. Kuanhu was filled with tension and excitement. However, in 8 days, Siwoo mistakenly saw Kuanhu as Yuchel. Siwoo entered the delivery room. Kuanhu, who was becoming a father for the first time, cried helplessly at the door. He was afraid that something might happen to his wife. Fortunately, everything went well. The butler reported the good news of the birth of a boy to the chairman. She said that although the baby was born a month early, his weight was normal. However, the chairman became suspicious. He then told his son-in-law about his plan to conduct a paternity test. He said that since the child was born into a wealthy family, a paternity test was a necessary procedure, especially since the child was born a month early. Taejoon then told Kuanhu about this. However, Kuanhu, blinded by love, refused. He said he trusted Siwoo completely, but as soon as he stepped outside, he recalled scenes from before they were married. Back then, Siwoo often said that his stomach was uncomfortable. The more he thought about it, the more suspicious he felt. He then told his wife about his grandfather's desire to conduct a paternity test. Upon hearing her husband's words, Siwoo became extremely nervous. She asked her husband if he was suspecting her. Seeing his wife looking so wronged, Kuanhu dismissed his suspicions about his wife. However, his grandfather was still insistent. Woljin told Taejoon that if Kuanhu still refused, he would personally take a paternity test with his great-grandson. Upon hearing his father-in-law's words, Taejoon was shocked. He feared that his father-in-law would discover the secret he had hidden for so many years. Therefore, he could only go back to plead with Kuanhu. However, Kuanhu remained firm in his refusal to take a paternity test. At that moment, Siwoo was also tossing and turning in the hospital, because she also knew deep down that this child was not biologically related to her husband. She absolutely could not let her husband take the paternity test. After being discharged from the hospital, she found her grandfather and told him about her willingness to take the paternity test. The two then rushed to the hospital. Siwoo said she didn't want her husband to be unhappy. She also hoped her grandfather would keep the secret for her. Seeing her granddaughter-in-law's polite demeanor, Woljin readily agreed. However, the test results showed that they were indeed related. Upon hearing this news, Taejoon was utterly shocked. Kuanhu, who had also learned of the matter, rushed into the room and embraced his wife tightly. However, he did not know that although the child was his grandfather's great-grandson, he had no blood relation to him. At that moment, Yuchel was also taken by the elderly man to a fortune-teller. The fortune-teller immediately recognized that Yuchel had an extraordinary destiny. He said that Yuchel must go to the center of the world and seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change his destitute fate. So Yuchel asked the old man for a loan of 10 million won in cash, and promised to repay him with interest doubled in a year. To repay Yuchel for saving his life. The old man agreed readily. Yuchel then took the money to a securities company to open an account. Perhaps it was due to his diligent studies and relentless efforts. Or maybe, as the fortune teller had said, he was born with the secret to wealth and prosperity. A year later, the funds in Yuchel's account had multiplied several dozen times, reaching hundreds of millions in cash. The employees at the securities company were astonished by Yuchel's returns, saying they had never seen such high yields. As they left, the employees looked at Yuchel with envious eyes. She hoped Yuchel would contact her privately. When Yuchel placed the 2 million cash in front of the old man couldn't believe his eyes. When he saw all the profits Yuchel had made in a year, he was even more astonished. Yuchel then took the money and found his savior, handing it over to Rona. When they discovered there was 10 million in cash inside, they were astonished. The money-hungry old man found Yuchel again. He wanted to invest more money in Yuchel to earn even higher returns. Yuchel also presented his own conditions. He wanted the old man to help him change his identity. Upon hearing this, the old man readily agreed. Soon, he arranged for Yuchel to obtain a new ID card. Yuchel no longer had to hide in the shadows. He would continue his life under the new name Tayeong. The old man then handed 200 million cash to Yuchel. He hoped Yuchel could help him make even more money. On the other side, Rona made a bold decision. She handed the money to Yuchel again, stating she also wanted to use 10 million to make 100 million. A year later, under Yuchel's guidance, the old man's account had more than 10 times the original amount. He also instructed the securities company employees to transfer all the money to his home. The employees were shocked when they saw the numbers in the old man's account. To express his gratitude to Yuchel, the old man specially treated him to a lavish meal. At this point, Yuchel, who had already made a fortune, was still unsatisfied. He decided to go abroad to develop his career. There, he would have greater opportunities for growth. He swore to make even more money, so he could take revenge on his girlfriend. He was determined to trample the woman who had abandoned him under his feet. However, Kuanhu did not share Yuchel's fate. In just a few short years, he lost hundreds of billions of dollars. Taejun was utterly speechless at his son's failure. Now, he had become the laughingstock of his ass family. Meanwhile, the wealthy heiress he had once abandoned has actually ended up with his cousin. With no other options, Junhee had no choice but to involve his daughter-in-law Siu in the company's management. Before long, several years had passed. The once humble Yuchel had transformed into Taeyeong. His status was now unrecognizable. The scar on his forehead had been covered with a skin graft that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Today, the companies under Taeyeong's control are worth trillions of dollars. He has also moved into a wealthy villa district in Seoul. Upon returning home, he recalls the words of the feng shui master. The feng shui master said that this villa is a feng shui treasure trove that attracts wealth and good fortune. It is even better than the feng shui of the chairman's house next door. Taeyeong looks at the chairman's house next door. A flame of revenge is slowly rising from his heart. Meanwhile, Woljin is discussing the new neighbors. It turned out that Junhee had long wanted to buy this house and give it to her son and daughter-in-law. She wondered who was so powerful to have bought such a good house. Siwoo quickly said it didn't matter. However, her aunt said it wasn't that simple, because the feng shui of the neighboring house was better than their own. After hearing her daughter's words, Woljin angrily left the living room. That night, Taeyeong looked at Woljin's yard again. He also saw a familiar figure in the yard. It was Siwoo, who had abandoned him and married into a wealthy family. Perhaps he was involved in his attempted murder back then. Seeing his ex-girlfriend and her husband so close, he swore that he would make this family pay dearly. Back inside, he also received a call from the feng shui master. He told the feng shui master that the house was still a bit small. He wanted to move into a bigger house. It turned out that he wanted to buy the house next door that belonged to the chairman. At this point, the feng shui master also began to suspect Taeyeong's true intentions. The next morning, Taeyeong asked the maid to send an invitation to the neighbors. He wanted the chairman's family to attend his housewarming banquet. His revenge plan had only just begun. Soon after, Junhee received the invitation. She never expected the neighbors to be so shameless. Not only did they take the house she wanted to buy, but they also had the nerve to send an invitation to her family for the banquet. She told her daughter-in-law and son to go to the banquet next door. She said she and her husband weren't interested in the people next door. Siwoo could only agree reluctantly. However, that night, she saw a familiar figure at her front door. She never expected that the boyfriend she had been thinking about day and night was still alive. She never expected that her boyfriend was her new neighbor. Yuchel had clearly died several years ago. Now she was seeing someone who looked exactly like Yuchel. Yuchel had a scar on his forehead. However, the man in front of her had no such scar. She couldn't believe her eyes. She wasn't sure if this new neighbor was her ex-boyfriend. The next day, everyone in the family was talking about the new neighbors next door. It was said that this man was a professional investor who had just returned from the United States. Not only had he invested in many listed companies, but he also controlled assets worth trillions of dollars. Today was the housewarming banquet for the neighbors. Her family also had to send someone of a similar age to attend. Perhaps that man might be interested in investing in her family's company. Siwoo also wanted to confirm the relationship between him and her ex-boyfriend. Soon, everyone rushed to the man's house. Seeing a face identical to her ex-boyfriend's, Siwoo was also extremely embarrassed. Everyone found out that the man was the chairman of Taeyong Investment Group. His net worth was now over $1 trillion. Siwoo thought her ex-boyfriend could never have become so wealthy in just a few years. However, during dinner, Taeyong talked about his investment experience. He said he had a clear goal in mind. He just treated investing as a game. After hearing Taeyong's words, Siwoo recalled that Yuchel had once said the same thing to her. She found it unbelievable. After dinner, Taeyong prepared a sumptuous dessert. However, Siwoo had a stomachache from eating sweets. Taeyong kindly gave her some medicine. Siwoo also thought about the little moments she shared with her ex-boyfriend before he passed away. This made her even more suspicious of Taeyong's identity. She asked Taeyong if he recognized her. However, Taeyong said he had lived in the United States for a long time. He also asked Siwoo if she had ever traveled to the United States. When Siwoo was about to ask more questions, Kuanhu suddenly entered the room and interrupted their conversation. After returning to the company, Siwoo instructed her subordinates to investigate Taeyong's true identity. However, she didn't know that her ex-boyfriend, who had changed his identity, was seeking revenge on her. Taeyong felt that everything that happened to him back then was somehow connected to his girlfriend. That day, the two met again. However, Taeyong pretended not to recognize her. Siwoo believed that Yuchel must have lost his memory in the car accident. She examined Taeyong's forehead closely. However, she couldn't find any scars similar to Yuchel's. She knew that Yuchel was allergic to seafood, so she invited Taeyong to dinner. After hearing Siwoo's words, Taeyong gladly accepted. Siwoo then instructed the butler to prepare her best soy sauce crab dish for the next day. The next day, Taeyong dressed up and prepared to go to Siwoo's house for dinner, but he didn't know that Siwoo was testing him. During the meal, Siwoo pushed the crab toward him. She wanted Taeyong to try her cooking. Seeing the pain on Taeyong's face, her suspicions grew even stronger. Taeyong had no choice but to eat it so as not to expose himself. He even praised her cooking. Seeing that Taeyong didn't react, she dismissed her suspicions. However, she didn't know that Taeyong had immediately taken an anti-allergy medication after returning home. After lying down in bed, Taeyong's entire body began to itch. After Taeyong left, Siwoo felt utterly devastated. Looking at her husband in front of her, she wished her boyfriend were still alive. If it weren't for avenging her boyfriend, she would never have married Kuanhu. At that moment, Junhee also recalled the scene she had witnessed earlier that day. She realized that Taeyong bore an uncanny resemblance to her first love. Why had Taejun never mentioned his first love? Taejun believed that what had happened in the past was irrelevant. Junhee said she took Kuanhu every year to pay respects to her first love. Taejun said he had known all along. He didn't want to argue with his wife over the past. After hearing her husband's words, Junhee felt even more guilty. Taejun said that regardless of whether he and Kuanhu were related by blood, he would live happily with his wife and son. Siwoo, who had just come downstairs, overheard her father-in-law's words. She swore to expose her father-in-law's ugly true nature. Taejun is Kuanhu's stepfather on the surface, but as the only son in the family, he is not willing to accept this. 30 years ago, he secretly switched Junhee's baby. He is Kuanhu's biological father. However, Kuanhu has no idea about this. He has always thought that Taejun was just his stepfather. Taejun is determined to raise Kuanhu to be the heir of a wealthy family. However, Kuanhu is ungrateful. He believes that everything should rightfully belong to him. He didn't even attend his grandmother's funeral. Seeing this, Taejun is heartbroken. Fortunately, Siwoo brings his grown son to the funeral. Looking at his well-behaved grandson, Taejun can't hide his feelings of injustice. He hugs his grandson close. He longs to reveal the secret he has been keeping hidden in his heart. However, Siwoo looked at him with disdain. Taejun didn't know that Kuanhu had also become the stepfather of his child. In fact, the grandson in front of him wasn't biologically related to him either. After his mother's funeral, Taejun drank alone in silence. Soon, he was drunk. The waiter saw this and called Kuanhu. Taejun looked at his son and finally revealed the secret that he was his biological father. Kuanhu was utterly shocked by his stepfather's words. Although he knew it might just be drunken rambling, he couldn't help but question his own origins. He decided to take his stepfather home first and ask him for an explanation once he sobered up. The next day, he rushed to his stepfather's office. However, Taejun had forgotten what he had said the night before. He also told Kuanhu not to tell anyone about it. On the way home, Kuanhu thought about how his stepfather had been furious with him for not visiting his sick grandmother, even when no one else was around. His stepfather always acted like he was his father. This made him even more suspicious about his origins. After returning home, Kuanhu asked his mother about his biological father. He said that since he didn't look like his mother, he must have inherited his father's genes in appearance. However, Junhee gave a negative answer. Back in his room, Kuanhu recalled what his grandmother had said to him at the hospital. His grandmother had said that Kuanhu looked a lot like his grandfather. The next day, he took his stepfather's heir to the hospital. He wanted to do a paternity test with his stepfather. He then took the test results to the company. By this point, he hated his father with all his heart, but he didn't reveal the truth. He only angrily said that he had no interest in being the heir to this wealthy family. Upon hearing his son's words, Taejun had no idea what had happened. That night, Kuanhu returned home drunk. Looking at his kind-hearted mother before him, he never imagined that he had no blood relation with her. Junhee was unaware of the true reason behind her son's drunkenness. After returning to his room, Kuanhu grew increasingly heartbroken. The next day, he confronted his father and demanded to know who his real mother was. Taejun lied, claiming that she was a heartless woman. She had abandoned Kuanhu at the hospital. On the same day, Junhee gave birth to a baby boy at the hospital. Taejun said he had no choice but to swap the two children. He couldn't abandon his son like that woman had. The other child was sent to an orphanage and later died in a traffic accident. Kuanhu never imagined that he wasn't part of this wealthy family. He then drove back home. In 8 days, he nearly hit a woman walking by. However, he didn't know that the woman he nearly hit was his biological mother, Miran, and Miran was currently living right next door. Miran also never expected to meet her son under such circumstances. After returning home, Junhee noticed that her son had been very depressed lately. She was extremely worried. Junhee anxiously asked her son what had happened. Kuanhu looked at his pitiful mother. He decided to find the right moment to reveal the secret in his heart. However, to his surprise, his father had already found his wife. Taejun also revealed Kuanhu's true identity. He asked Siwoo to persuade Kuanhu to keep this secret. In fact, Siwoo had known about this all along. She couldn't wait to expose her father-in-law's crimes. However, Taejun said that if this secret were to be revealed, they would all be implicated. In order to regain everything Yuchel had lost, Siwoo had no choice but to agree to persuade her husband to keep this secret. That night, Siwoo ran into Taeyeon again. She said that Taeyeon looked a lot like her ex-boyfriend. Taeyeon also wanted to know if Siwoo had been sincere with him back then. Just then, Rona suddenly appeared and interrupted their conversation. Siwoo watched Taeyeon's departing figure. She wished so much that Taeyeon was Yuchel. Taeyeon also turns to look at Siwoo's back. He also wants to know the real reason why she abandoned him. The next day, Siwoo drinks with her colleagues to drown her sorrows. She tells them about her father-in-law's murder of her ex-boyfriend. She married into this wealthy family to avenge her boyfriend. Her colleagues know that she must have suffered a lot over the years. Siwoo feels much better after revealing the secret. She said she not only wanted to avenge her boyfriend, but also wanted to make her boyfriend's son the heir to this wealthy family. At that moment, Taeyong was also drinking with his colleagues. He told his colleagues that his ex-girlfriend was everything to him. He blamed her for not recognizing him. He wanted to know why she had betrayed him and married into a wealthy family. However, at that moment, he didn't know that Siwoo had already recognized him. All they needed was an opportunity to recognize each other. After leaving the restaurant, Siwoo, who was drunk, kept muttering that her boyfriend wasn't dead. At that moment, Taeyong was also on his way home. He was still struggling with why his girlfriend couldn't recognize him. The two people who deeply loved each other met again. They slowly approached each other. However, Rona appeared beside Taeyong. Siwoo saw this and held back her tears. She knew that this man no longer belonged to her. Taeyong was also worried that the person he loved deeply would misunderstand him. He wanted to run after her to explain. However, he was already too drunk to do anything. Rona had been lusting after Taeyong for a long time. As she passed by the hotel, she began to hesitate. She recalled what her mother had told her. Her mother had said that she must not let other women take this handsome and wealthy man away from her. If Taeyong was healthy, she must make him her son-in-law. Rona agreed with her mother. Besides, she was already at the age where she should get married. She then took Taeyong to the hotel. However, looking at Taeyong, who was drunk and lying on the ground, she didn't know what to do. Just as she was about to leave, Taeyong grabbed her hand and shouted Siwoo's name. Taeyong opened his eyes with all his strength. He had mistaken Rona for Siwoo. At that moment, Miran was anxiously waiting for her daughter to come home. She hurriedly dialed their phones. However, both of their phones were turned off. Miran felt that the two of them must be together. She also hoped that the two of them would grow closer tonight. The next morning, after sobering up, Taeyong realized he had made a mistake. He felt incredibly guilty. Seeing Taeyong's expression, Rona told him not to dwell on it. After saying that, she turned and left. After leaving, Rona recalled the name Taeyeon had called out. She knew Taeyeon had mistaken her for someone else. This made her incredibly sad. Seeing Rona's sad expression, Taeyong felt deeply ashamed. In the days that followed, he deliberately avoided Rona. Rona was also afraid of running into Taeyeon. He stayed home and didn't go out. Miran also noticed something was wrong between the two. She began to suspect their relationship. Rona, who hadn't left the house in a long time, wanted to go out for a walk. She happened to run into Siwoo, who had just returned home. Rona said the soy sauce crab he brought was really delicious, but Taeyeon was actually allergic to seafood. Upon hearing Rona's words, Siwoo was shocked. She wanted to know what Taeyeon had been through all these years. Rona then recounted what had happened to Taeyeon. She said that when Taeyeon woke up, the first person he had asked for was Siwoo. At that time, Rona did not know that the woman in front of her was Siwoo. From Rona's description, Siwoo confirmed that Yuchel was still alive. She thought that Yuchel was angry because she had left him. That's why he changed his name and came back to take revenge on her. She didn't know how to explain this to Yuchel. She also didn't know if he would believe her. Perhaps it was a father-son bond. Siwoo's son and Taeyeon were very close. Although Taeyeon harbored resentment towards Siwoo, he knew that this had nothing to do with the innocent child. No matter what the child asked for, he would readily agree. That day, the two agreed to go on a picnic at the farm. Neither of them knew about the other's relationship. Siwoo, because of her son. The three of them finally sat together, looking at the man she deeply loved before her. Siwoo recalled the moments they had shared. She couldn't forget the happy memories she had with her boyfriend. Her son didn't know why his mother was crying. He naively thought it was because her eyes were uncomfortable. Taeyeon, who was determined to seek revenge, saw this scene and felt a pang of pity. That night, Kuanhu came to pick up Siwoo and her son. Watching them leave, Taeyong's heart began to waver. The woman he deeply loved had built a happy family with another man, yet he was still alone and lonely. At that moment, the flames of revenge once again ignited in his mind. The next day, he picked up his revenge plan. He also discussed with his colleagues how to destroy Yangdi Group, his girlfriend's company. Rona was puzzled by this. She believed that Taeyeon must have some deep hatred toward Yangdi Group. Siwoo also noticed something was off. In the future, Yangdi Group would need Taeyeon's son to inherit the company. However, Taeyeon was determined to destroy the company. She couldn't let things escalate to the point where father and son would be at odds. So she decided to talk to Taeyeon and convince him to let go of his hatred. But Taeyeon had already made up his mind to seek revenge. However, their conversation was overheard by Rona, who happened to be passing by. She finally learned the truth. It turned out that the woman in front of her was Taeyeon's ex-girlfriend, Siwoo, so she decided to move out of Taeyeon's house with her mother. However, during dinner, Rona suddenly felt nauseous. After checking the calendar, she realized that her period was late. The next day, she found out from the doctor that she was pregnant. She then told Taeyeon about her pregnancy. Upon hearing her words, Taeyeon was shocked. Rona said she wouldn't ask Taeyeon to take responsibility, but she felt that Taeyeon needed to know about it. After returning home, Taeyeon was very hesitant. He couldn't let go of his feelings for Siwoo. However, when he saw Siwoo's family living happily together, he finally made up his mind. So he called Rona and asked her to come out. Taeyong said he truly didn't have any feelings for her, but that he would only love her from now on. He hoped they could get married. However, Rona refused. She knew Taeyong was doing this for the child in her womb. He didn't truly love her. Taeyong explained that he had been an orphan since childhood. He had always longed for his parents' love. He promised he would let go of his past and give her his true feelings from now on. The next day, they told their families about their plans to get married. The families were overjoyed to hear the news. The old man asked Taeyeon for his birth date and time. He insisted that a feng shui master help choose an auspicious date. However, when the feng shui master saw Taeyeon's birth date and time, he was utterly shocked. He never imagined such a coincidence could exist, because Taeyeon's birth date and time shared the same imperial destiny as Kuanhu's. Meanwhile, Junghee kept urging her daughter-in-law to have a second child. However, Siwoo refused. It turned out that she and her husband had been sleeping separately for years. She also harbored a shocking secret. Kuanhu wanted to know why his wife refused to have a second child. He hadn't slept with his wife in a long time. Kuanhu didn't know that his wife had married him to avenge her boyfriend. His son actually had no blood relation to him. Now Siwoo discovers that her ex-boyfriend is not dead. Taeyong still believes she abandoned him to marry into a wealthy family. To clear up her boyfriend's misunderstanding, she gathers her courage and finds Taeyong. Taeyong confronts her about why she abandoned him. Siwoo wants to find a more private place to vent her grievances from the past years. However, just as she was about to leave, she saw her younger sister-in-law, Ji-yoon. Ji-yoon looked at her nervous sister-in-law. She felt that her sister-in-law and this man had an unusual relationship. The best opportunity to clear up the misunderstanding was thus interrupted. Siwoo watched her boyfriend's departing figure figure with great anxiety. The next day, she arranged to meet Taeyong again. However, just as she was about to reveal her secret, Taeyong suddenly interrupted her. He said his future wife was pregnant, and he had his own family now. Taeyong's words shocked Siwoo. He said his target for revenge was Yangdi Group. He told Siwoo to forget him. Siwoo didn't want to ruin Taeyong's family. She gave him her blessings and left heartbroken. As soon as Siwoo left, Taeyong held back his tears and looked at the next room. It turned out that Taeyong had said that to prove himself to Rona. At that moment, Siwoo felt incredibly heartbroken. She didn't know what she had done wrong. Her exhausted body finally couldn't withstand the blow and she fainted. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying in a hospital ward, looking at her husband silently watching over her. Siwoo was deeply grateful to her husband. Kuanhu thought his wife didn't want to have a second child, which was why she had fainted. He felt incredibly guilty. After going through this, Siwoo came to terms with it. She agreed to give her husband a second child. Kuanhu was surprised by his wife's sudden change. However, he didn't know that Siwoo had been unable to forget her ex-boyfriend all these years. When she heard the news of Taeyong's marriage, Siwoo finally made up her mind to protect her family. A month later, Siwoo told her husband about her pregnancy. Upon hearing his wife's words, Kuanhu excitedly embraced her. Kuanhu excitedly shared the news with his family. Woljin was overjoyed upon hearing the news. That day, when Siwoo went to the hospital for a prenatal checkup, she unexpectedly saw Taeyong. Watching the two of them act so intimately, she felt an inexplicable sense of loss. Just then, a motorcycle came and knocked Siwoo down. Taeyong, who had just come out of the parking lot, also saw this. He was about to get out of the car, but his wife stopped him. He saw Siwoo slowly getting out in the rearview mirror. For the sake of the child in his wife's womb, Taeyong left heartlessly. Seeing Taeyong leave without caring about her, Siwoo felt utterly despairing. At that moment, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Her husband, who had rushed to the hospital, also sought his wife. In the end, their child could not be saved. Kuanhu tried his best to comfort his grieving wife. He said that as long as she was okay, that was all that mattered. However, what truly broke Siwoo's heart was not just the loss of their child, it was also Taeyong's cold heart toward her. At that moment, Taeyong was also reminiscing about the scene. His heart couldn't calm down. He regretted not getting out of the car and choosing to leave so cruelly. Rona was afraid that Taeyong would rekindle his feelings for Siwoo, so she told Taeyong that she wanted to move away from there. Taeyong, who was determined to forget Siwoo, agreed readily. He then made the decision to move to the United States. Before leaving, Taeyong saw Siwoo's son. He bid farewell to the beau with great reluctance. Taeyong was still unaware that he was the beau's biological father. He then drove to the airport with his wife. Siwoo was shocked to learn from his son that Taeyong had moved. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Taeyong returned from the United States with his wife and daughter. He was now a wealthy man. However, Siwoo was no longer able to have children. Moreover, Yangdi Group was facing a financial crisis. Fortunately, Woljin still had some connections in politics. An official informed Woljin that a piece of wasteland was about to be designated as a free trade zone. A company called Shinmi Foods owned a large plot of land in that area. If they could acquire Shinmi Foods, the land alone would be worth billions. However, when Siwoo and her husband were preparing to acquire Shinmi Foods, Taeyong suddenly decided to invest in Shinmi Foods. Siwoo believed that Taeyong was seeking revenge against her, so she angrily confronted Taeyong, demanding to know why he was targeting her. However, Taeyong denied it. He angrily asked Siwoo why she had married his enemy, but Taeyong did not know that Siwoo had married into the Yangdi Group to help him seek revenge. Siwoo felt incredibly wronged at that moment, but she also misunderstood Taeyong. Shinmei Food was a charitable company. Taeyong, who had grown up in an orphanage, had completed his education thanks to scholarships from Shinmei Food. His investment in the struggling Shinmei Food company was simply an act of gratitude. After Siwoo caused such a commotion, Taeyong began to suspect her motives for acquiring Shinmei Food. He immediately instructed his colleagues to increase the investment in Shinmei Food. Siwoo's attempt to acquire the company hit another roadblock. She had no choice but to approach Taeyong again. Seeing Siwoo's anxious expression, Taeyong finally revealed the truth about his debt of gratitude. Siwoo realized she had misunderstood Taeyong. She promised Taeyong she would do everything in her power to save Shinmei Food Company. Upon hearing Siwoo's words, Taeyong reluctantly agreed. However, what Taeyong didn't expect was that Taejun had already sent someone to investigate him. Taejun believed that Taeyong was the Yuchel he had once murdered, so he had Miran steal Taeyong's toothbrush and conducted a DNA comparison with his wife. The moment he received the results, he finally discovered Taeyong's true identity. Meanwhile, just as Siwoo was about to leave, an accident nearly occurred. Taeyong pulled her into his arms. Siwoo also felt a long-lost warmth. After regaining her composure, she left awkwardly. However, Ji-yoon had witnessed the entire scene. She then handed the photo to her brother Kuanhu and mocked him. After Ji-yoon left, Kuanhu looked at the photo and couldn't believe his wife would betray him. When he got home, he confronted his wife. He didn't believe her explanation at all. He suspected that his wife and Taeyeon had a special relationship. He then returned to his study and drank alone. Taejun asked his son why he was drinking. Kuanhu didn't tell his father about his wife. He complained about how he was inferior to Taeyeon in every way. To motivate his son, Taejun revealed that Taeyeon was actually Junhee's biological son. Kuanhu finally learned Taeyeon's true identity. After Taejun left, he recalled his wife's expression when she saw Yuchel. It turned out that Taeyeon was Siwoo's ex-boyfriend. The next day, Kuanhu grew even more suspicious of his wife at work. He recalled that his wife had been vomiting before they started dating, and that his son didn't resemble him at all. His son's eating habits were also the same as his grandfather's. Could his son be the child of his wife and Yuchel? To dispel his doubts, he rushed to the hospital to ask the doctor about the results of the paternity test. After being informed by the doctor, Kuanhu finally learned the truth. He never imagined that the son he loved so dearly had no blood relation to him. That night, Kuanhu confronted his wife and asked her if Taeyeon knew about this. Upon hearing her husband's words, Siwoo was utterly shocked. She said that Taeyeon didn't know yet. Siwoo feared that her husband would go after Taeyeon for revenge, so she hurriedly knelt before her husband. Unbeknownst to them, this scene was witnessed by Taeyeon, who was in the next room. He didn't know what was going on, but at that moment, he was extremely worried. Lying in bed, Taeyeon tossed and turned. Unable to sleep, he felt that Siwoo kneeling before Kuanhu must mean that Kuanhu had found out about their relationship. The next morning, Kuanhu found him. Kuanhu was furious and punched Taeyeon to the ground. Taeyeon fought back just as fiercely. He said that Siwoo and he were just former lovers, and that they no longer had any relationship. Taeyeon didn't want to destroy Siwoo's family, so he had to say that to dispel Kuanhu's suspicions about Siwoo. However, at that moment, Siwoo had already decided to divorce Kuanhu. She had married Kuanhu to avenge Yuchel. Now that she knew Yuchel was still alive, she saw no reason to stay in this household any longer. Upon returning home, Siwoo confronted her husband. She said she couldn't endure this life anymore. She wanted to leave the house with their child. Kuanhu believed that if his wife divorced him, she would take their child to Taeyeon. Enraged, he grabbed a golf club and headed toward Taeyeon's house. Siwoo desperately tried to stop her husband. Kuanhu angrily said that Siwoo was no different from his father. Siwoo retorted that if it weren't for his father, she would have been living happily with Taeyeon long ago. Kuanhu was speechless. He said he would never agree to a divorce under any circumstances. Siwoo was in immense pain. What she never expected was that Taejun had already told Woljin that Taeyeon was actually Yuchel, and that Taeyeon had been opposing Yangdi group all along. Upon hearing his son-in-law's words, Woljin harbored murderous intent toward Taeyeon. He entrusted the matter to his son-in-law to handle. However, the next day, he saw Taeyeon leading his daughter. Seeing this scene, he immediately felt pity. He hurriedly called his son-in-law to stop the operation. However, Taejun, who was determined to eliminate Taeyeon, refused to give up this opportunity. He instructed his secretary to proceed with the original plan. That day, the feng shui master called Taeyong and told him that he would face a major disaster soon. He urged Taeyeon to be extra cautious. Soon, his words came true. Several thugs kidnapped Taeyeon. However, Taeyong was not worried. After hearing the fortune teller's warning, he had already made preparations. He had already installed a tracking device on his body. Soon, his bodyguards arrived at the scene. The thugs froze in shock upon seeing the group of bodyguards. Taeyong wanted to uncover the mastermind behind the entire operation. However, the thugs had no idea who the real mastermind was. Taeyong had already guessed that his kidnapping was somehow connected to the Yangdi group, but at that moment, he didn't know that the disaster the feng shui master had warned about hadn't been averted. Taeyong was about to face an even greater blow. Soon after, Taejun also learned that the operation had failed. He never expected Taeyeon to be so lucky. Both operations had been foiled by him. Now he hated Taeyeon with a vengeance. Soon he found out that Taeyeon had once been in a relationship with his own daughter-in-law. He also began to suspect Siwoo. Perhaps Siwoo marrying Kuanhu was part of a plot. He also began to doubt the bloodline of his grandson. The next day, he took his grandson's toothbrush to the company and arranged for his secretary to take it to the hospital for a paternity test. He hoped that what he feared would not come to pass. However, when he saw the results, he was utterly shocked. He never imagined that the grandson he had doted on so much had no blood relation to him at all. After returning home, he told Kuanhu about it. But to his surprise, Kuanhu already knew about it. Taejun wanted to send his grandson abroad under the pretext of studying abroad, so that his daughter-in-law wouldn't act rashly. To keep his wife by his side, Kuanhu agreed readily. Taejun then called Miran and told her to get rid of Taeyeon. However, as Taeyeon's mother-in-law, Miran refused to agree under any circumstances. She threatened to go to the police station and turn herself in. Taejun had no choice but to arrange a meeting with Miran, claiming there was an important matter to discuss. However, as soon as Miran stepped out, she was kidnapped by several thugs. At that moment, her granddaughter spotted the phone her grandmother had left behind. She grabbed the phone and rushed out after them. However, a sudden accident claimed her life. Upon learning that someone had been killed, the kidnappers immediately abandoned Miran. However, Miran knew nothing about what had happened. Taeyong sat in front of his daughter's funeral hall for a long time, unwilling to leave. Rona also wanted to stay there with her daughter. After returning home, she looked at the phone found at the scene of her daughter's car accident. She recalled the scene of the accident. Could her daughter have been trying to deliver the phone to her grandmother when the accident happened? Rona confronted her mother, asking why she hadn't taken the phone with her. Miran, aware of her guilt, was speechless. She recalled the phone call she had received before her granddaughter's accident. She believed that her kidnapping was somehow connected to Taejun. After spending the entire day at the funeral hall, Taeyong returned home. He recalled what his colleague had told him. After confirming with witnesses, his daughter had been screaming for her grandmother while holding the phone and running out. At this point, he also began to suspect his mother-in-law. Rona also asked her mother to replace the original phone, because it was this phone that had killed her daughter. Their conversation was overheard by Taeyong. The next morning, Taeyong quietly entered his mother-in-law's room. He found the phone that had been replaced in the drawer. A phone number in the call log piqued his curiosity. He then rushed to his mother-in-law's shop. The phone suddenly rang at that moment. This further intensified his suspicion toward his mother-in-law. Miran immediately arranged to meet with Taejun. Taejun said he was deeply sorry for the death of his granddaughter and insisted he had nothing to do with it. However, to his surprise, everything was witnessed by Taeyong, who was standing outside the window. He never imagined that his mother-in-law was with his enemy. He secretly sent someone to follow his mother-in-law. When Miran met with Taejun again, a restaurant waiter pretended to accidentally knock over a cup of water and installed a listening device under their table. Taejun said that in order for their son to smoothly inherit Yangdi Group, he instructed Miran to persuade Taeyong not to oppose him. He did all this solely for the sake of their son. Later, Taeyong also obtained the recording of his mother-in-law and Taeju. Upon hearing the contents of the recording, he was utterly shocked. Since Kuanhu was his mother-in-law's son, then who was Woljin's true grandson? Since her daughter's death, Rona had decided to have another child, because she knew her husband had married her because of the child. Now their daughter had left. She felt she would inevitably be abandoned by her husband. However, Taeyong said he would never want another child. Rona was utterly confused. Taeyong said it was because everyone he loved had left him, and he was afraid. Upon hearing this, Rona drank in sorrow. Her mother urged her to stay strong. She must have another child with her son-in-law. For her daughter's sake, she had no choice but to tell Taeyong about the other child. Upon hearing her mother's words, Rona couldn't believe it. Miran said that Taeyong's ex-girlfriend was already pregnant when she married Kuanhu, but Taeyong knew nothing about it. She told her daughter to keep this secret at all costs. Rona couldn't bear this sudden blow. However, what she never expected was that her phone received photos of her husband with Siwoo. She hurried to the address in the text message. She indeed saw her husband at the cafe. That evening, when Taeyong returned home, Rona's attitude toward him changed instantly. She did not reveal the truth about her husband and the other child. Taeyong, still immersed in the grief of losing his daughter, was completely speechless toward his wife. He then slammed the door and left. Miran also tried to persuade her son-in-law. She said that Rona must get pregnant with a second child as soon as possible. That way, everyone could move on from their grief. But at that moment, she didn't know that Taeyong had already discovered the secret she had been hiding for years. The next day, Taeyong found the feng shui master. He revealed that his mother-in-law was actually Kuanhu's biological mother. Upon hearing Taeyong's words, the feng shui master was also deeply shocked. Taeyong said that he and Kuanhu were born on the same day. Since Kuanhu wasn't Woljin's grandson, then who was Woljin's grandson? The next day, the feng shui master rang the doorbell at Woljin's house. Junhee welcomed the feng shui master warmly. However, when Junhee answered the phone, the feng shui master directly took her teacup. The feng shui master then rushed to Taeyong's house. He told Taeyong to take the teacup to the hospital for a DNA test. The next day, Taeyong received the test results with a heavy heart. He finally discovered his true identity. It turned out that Junhee was his biological mother. From the feng shui master, he learned that the mastermind behind everything was likely Taejun. Perhaps it was he who had swapped the newborn Taeyong. Taeyong swore to expose Taechun's crimes and reclaim the life that rightfully belonged to him. The next morning, Taeyong encountered his biological mother. However, Junhee was still unaware that Taeyong was her son. She wanted to talk to him. The two then went to a coffee shop. Junhee didn't want Taeyeon to oppose her family anymore. She said that the car accident decades ago was just an accident, and that the recent kidnapping must have been a misunderstanding. Taeyong found his mother's words utterly ridiculous. He said that the kidnappers had almost thrown him into the sea. If he hadn't hired bodyguards in advance, he would have lost his life that day. Upon hearing Taeyong's words, Junhee was also deeply shocked. She said she never imagined such a thing could happen. She begged Taeyeon not to target her son anymore. She said that because of Taeyeon, her son's marriage was about to fall apart. The company had also gone through multiple crises. She said that as a mother, she had to save her son. After hearing his mother's words, Taeyeon was even more heartbroken. His biological son was sitting right in front of her, yet she was still thinking about that fake son. He refused his mother and left angrily. Junhee returned home and was shocked to find her husband so ruthless. He had gone as far as killing someone for the sake of their family company. She didn't know that her husband had made the decision to eliminate Taeyong out of fear that he would reunite with his biological son. Back at the company, Taeyong reflected on his mother's words. Since Siwoo's family was on the brink of collapse, he believed Siwoo must be hiding something from him. He confronted Siwoo and demanded to know if she was hiding anything. However, Siwoo couldn't tell Taeyeon the truth because her child had already been sent to the United States by her father-in-law. She feared that revealing the truth would cause her to lose her child. With nothing to show for his efforts, Taeyong left dejected. However, on his way back, he encountered Ji-yoon. Ji-yoon mocked Taeyeon before, and at the same time, she suspected that the child Siwoo had given birth to was Taeyeon's. Back at the company, Taeyong felt more and more uneasy. He hurriedly asked his colleague beside him. The colleague said that when the news of his car accident was just announced, Siwoo had gone to Italy with Kuanhu. After returning from Italy, Siwoo married into a wealthy family. Taeyong suspected that Siwoo must have married Kuanhu while pregnant with his child, so she hurriedly called Siwoo. However, Siwoo refused to meet with him. Taeyong had no choice but to go to the building where Siwoo worked. Upon seeing Siwoo, he urgently asked her if the child was his. Seeing Siwoo's panicked expression, Taeyong finally confirmed his suspicions. However, Siwoo refused to admit it. Just as she was about to leave, Taeyong grabbed her arm and took her to a coffee shop. Taeyong said that if she didn't admit it, he would go find Kuanhu himself to confirm it. After hearing Taeyong's words, Siwoo finally told the truth. Taeyong was shocked to learn that he indeed had another son. He demanded to know why Siwoo had done this. Seeing Taeyong's anxious expression, Siwoo finally explained the entire situation. She said that back then, she believed Taeyong was dead, so she married Kuanhu, who had been pursuing her while pregnant. Now that Kuanhu and her father-in-law also knew about this, they had sent their son to the United States to threaten her. Taeyong demanded to know why she had married his enemy. He said he would never forgive her in this lifetime. After saying this, Taeyong left angrily. Siwoo also wanted to tell him about her plan to avenge him, but she couldn't, because Taeyong now had a new family. She didn't want Taeyong to choose to be with her out of guilt. She can only endure the injustice alone. However, unexpectedly, she has a friend who stands up for the underdog. Upon learning of the situation, the friend immediately rushes to Taeyong's company. He then reveals Siwoo's true feelings. Taeyong is suddenly enlightened. He realizes that everything Siwoo has done over the years was for him. Now Taeyong finally knows the truth. He had been waiting downstairs at Siwoo's company all along. As soon as he saw Siwoo, he rushed over. He demanded to know why she had avenged him. Why had she silently endured all this? Siwoo replied, "Because I love you." Taeyong embraced her tightly. He knew she must have suffered greatly over the years. Siwoo finally cleared up Taeyong's misunderstanding about her. The two then went to a coffee shop. Siwoo said that her husband had sent their son abroad. The son wasn't just going abroad to study. Her father-in-law and husband had taken the child hostage. Taeyong told her not to worry. He would never let the child be in danger. The next morning, Taeyong arranged for his colleagues to buy a large number of shares in the Yangdi group. He intended to reclaim everything that had always belonged to him and punish those who had plotted against him. At that moment, Siwoo also asked her husband for a divorce. However, Kuanhu not only refused to agree to the divorce, but also threatened Siwoo with custody of their son. He did not want Siwoo and Taeyong to reunite so easily. With no other choice, Siwoo had no option but to seek out her father-in-law. She said that if her husband refused to divorce her, she would expose all the secrets of her father-in-law and her husband. Taejun then angrily went to find Kuanhu. However, to his surprise, Junhee had just arrived at the company. Their conversation also reached her ears. After hearing her husband's words, Junhee could no longer contain herself and burst into the room. She confronted her husband, demanding to know what he meant by his earlier words. Taejun didn't want his wife to discover his secret. He could only tell his wife that the grandson was his daughter-in-law's child with another man. Upon hearing her husband's words, Junhee was also extremely shocked. She had also guessed that Taeyong was the child's biological father. Taejun said this matter must not be revealed to his father-in-law. Junhee then stormed over to her daughter-in-law and slapped her hard across the face. face. At that moment, Siu desperately wanted to reveal that Taeyeon was her biological son, but she couldn't do it now, because her son was still in the hands of her father-in-law and husband. She could only endure the humiliation in silence. Soon after, Taeyong directly approached Kuanhu. He asked Kuanhu to hand over his son for him to raise. Kuanhu angrily refused, saying he would never agree to such a thing. He knew that once he divorced, Taeyong would definitely reunite with Siwoo. However, Taeyong deliberately said that he hated everything Siwoo had done to him. After saying that, he turned and left. Junhee also urged her son not to raise someone with no blood relation in their home. However, Kuanhu refused to agree. He also told his wife about Taeyeon wanting custody. He had thought his wife was determined to reunite with Taeyeon, but to his surprise, she also refused to give up custody. Kuanhu suspected his wife had already colluded with Taeyeon. In fact, he was right. Siwoo had already met with Taeyeon. Taeyeon told Siwoo he had sent people to the United States to find their son, and not to make any rash moves until they found him. He had already come up with a plan to get his son back. In order to make Taeyeon give up custody, Junhee went to see Taeyeon's mother-in-law. However, Miran looked nervous when she saw her. They had never met before, so why was she so afraid of her? Her husband found out that she had gone to see Taeyeon's mother-in-law. Junhee immediately became suspicious of her husband. She confronted him about his relationship with Taeyeon's mother-in-law. Taejun was worried that his secret would be exposed. He could only stammer and evade the question. He then found his son and told him to divorce quickly. Kuanhu, blinded by hatred, was still hesitating. Taejun never expected his son to be so weak. The next day, he received a call from Miran. That evening, the two met at the park. Miran said she couldn't let Kuanhu divorce. She urged Taejun to accept Siwoo's child. Taejun asked Miran to also consider Kuanhu. After all, Kuanhu was her own flesh and blood. However, their conversation was overheard by Junhee. She never imagined there was such a connection between them. The son she had raised for all these years had no blood relation to her at all. She recalled her husband's promise to her back then. It turned out that her husband had planned all of this in advance. Junhee could no longer bear this sudden blow. The next morning, Taejun didn't see his wife anywhere. He was worried that his wife had found out about his secret of switching the children. Fortunately, the housekeeper said that his wife had gone to meet a friend, which eased his concerns. Kuanhu also found out that his mother hadn't come home all night. He told his father that his mother hadn't answered his calls. He was worried that his mother had found out about his true identity. Taejun hurriedly comforted Kuanhu and told him to play the role of the heir to the wealthy family. However, what he didn't expect was that Junhee was currently standing at her ex-boyfriend's grave. She felt deeply guilty. Seeing the woman's sad expression, the feng shui master, who had already known the truth, gave her some advice. He said he knew someone who looked very much like her ex-boyfriend. When the feng shui master told her that the person was Taeyeon, Junhee finally realized the truth. She recalled the first time she met Taeyeon. Taeyong's every move was just like her ex-boyfriend, but she hadn't thought about it that way at the time. She recalled how her daughter-in-law had always urged her not to hate Taeyeon. Could her daughter-in-law have known about this all along? Junhee then rushed to Siwoo's office. She immediately voiced her doubts. After hearing her mother-in-law's words, Siwoo finally stopped hiding the truth. She told her mother-in-law the whole story. However, Junhee, who had found her son, felt incredibly guilty. Her son had been right beside her all along, yet she hadn't recognized him. Unable to bear it, Junhee fainted. Siwoo hurriedly took his mother to the hospital. When Junhee regained consciousness, Taeyong came to the hospital room. Seeing her son, Junhee felt incredibly guilty. She kept apologizing to her son. Taeyong had always believed that he had been abandoned by his mother. Now that he had finally found his mother, he felt incredibly fortunate. Junhee tightly held her son's hand. She never imagined that her husband would switch their sons. She swore to take back everything Taeyong had lost. Taeyong told his mother not to do anything. He revealed his plan for revenge. After returning home, Junhee looked at her sleeping husband. She wanted to kill him. However, her company was still in her husband's hands. She could only endure it for now. Although she tried her best to control her emotions, she felt sick whenever she heard Kuanhu call her mom. Kuanhu had no idea why his mother was angry. Back at the company, he thought about what his mother had said to him. Did his mother know his true identity? Just as he was wondering, his mother suddenly came into his office. He thought she had come to the company to persuade him to divorce. But Junhee said that if he and Siwoo didn't want to divorce, they shouldn't be so stubborn. She told Kuanhu to bring their grandson back from the United States so that Siwoo and her son could be reunited. That way, Kuanhu could win Siwoo's heart back. Kuanhu thought his mother was thinking of him, but he didn't know that his mother had other motives. When he got home that night, Kuanhu told his wife that he wanted to bring the child back from the United States. The three of them would start a new life together. Siwoo pretended to be shocked. Kuanhu had no choice but to call Taeyong. The three of them agreed to meet at the park. Taeyong said he had already found a lawyer, and that he would do whatever it takes to get his son back. After saying that, he left angrily. Kuanhu looked at his wife with schadenfreude, but he didn't know that the two of them were just putting on a show for him. He told his wife that he would bring their son back, and that they would live happily together like before. However, Siu said that her father would never agree to this. Kuanhu said that his mother was now on his side, and that he would go talk to his father tomorrow to convince him. The next day, Taejoon insisted that his son divorce. Kuanhu refused to agree. He even threatened his father that if he forced him to divorce, he would expose all the dirty deeds his father had done over the years. Taejoon angrily slapped his son across the face. He said that since the car accident last time, Siwoo could no longer have children. He didn't want Kuanhu to have no descendants. However, Kuanhu didn't care at all. Taejoon was completely speechless at his good-for-nothing son. After Kuanhu left, Taejoon felt very frustrated. He never thought that the bloodline of his family would be destroyed by his own son. However, what he didn't expect was that all of this was his wife and daughter-in-law's scheme. Soon, Junhee brought her grandson back to the country. Taeyong watched his son from afar. He also wanted to rush forward and recognize his son. Just then, Kuanhu arrived. Hearing his son call someone else father, Taeyong felt an unbearable pain in his heart. After returning home, Siwoo looked at her son, whom she hadn't seen in a long time. She still couldn't tell her son the truth about his birth. She was worried that he wouldn't be able to handle the shock. All she could do was take him to the park to secretly meet his biological father. Perhaps it was a father-son connection. Although the two didn't recognize each other, they talked happily. Siwoo also hoped they could reunite soon. However, there were many obstacles in the way of their family reunion. Taejoon was afraid that his plan to switch the babies would be exposed. He was determined to get rid of the young Jimin. Auntie's family also found out that Jimin was Taeyong's son. They were thinking of ways to make their son the heir to the family. In order to maintain her marriage with Taeyong, Rona also wanted custody of Jimin, so she approached Woljin and revealed Jimin's true identity. However, Woljin, who had already undergone a paternity test, refused to believe her. He believed that Rona was mentally unstable due to the loss of her daughter. Rona told him to ask his family. She said that everyone in his family knew the truth. When Woljin returned home, he happened to encounter his second daughter, Suki. He urgently asked Suki about the truth. Suki told her father that Jimin was indeed Taeyong's son. Upon hearing his daughter's words, Woljin was so enraged that he fainted. Shortly after, Taejoon learned that his father-in-law was hospitalized. He wished his father-in-law would die immediately, because only then would he have a chance to rise up. That day, when Jimin came downstairs, he saw his family arguing. He accidentally overheard a shocking secret. His father was not biologically related to him. The family noticed Jimin at that moment. Kuanhu hurried upstairs to explain to his son. Jimin locked himself in his room. He lay on the bed, heartbroken. He recalled what his mother had told him. His mother had never allowed him to get close to the neighbor's uncle. His father had also been angry with him for going to see the uncle. Now he finally understood why his parents had done that. It turned out that the uncle from the neighboring house was his real father. He couldn't understand why everyone had lied to him. However, Jimin didn't know that there was more to his background. Upon hearing the news, Siwoo also returned home. She knocked on her son's door. However, there was no response from inside. Siwoo felt incredibly guilty. The next morning, while the housekeeper wasn't paying attention, Jimin packed his backpack and sneaked out. Junhee hurried to her grandson's room. However, there was only a letter left in the room. It turned out that Jimin had decided to run away from home. Siwoo also hurried home. She told her mother-in-law that if something happened to her son, she didn't want to live anymore. Junhee tried her best to comfort her daughter-in-law. Kuanhu learned that his son had run away from home. He hurried to Taeyong's house, but after searching for a long time, he couldn't find Jimin. However, just as he was about to leave, Miran called him back. She asked Kuanhu to let her take Jimin into her care. Upon hearing her words, Kuanhu was furious. He said that Jimin absolutely could not be taken by Taeyong. At that moment, he didn't know that Miran was actually his biological mother. Miran was in a terrible dilemma. She had to maintain her daughter's marriage to Taeyong and didn't want to see her biological son hurt. She knew that all of this was her own doing. At that moment, Jimin, whose backpack had been stolen, saw a restaurant by the roadside but couldn't go in. Before he knew it, he had arrived at Taeyong's front door. He gathered his courage and rang the doorbell. Taeyong also saw his son on the surveillance camera. He rushed out, disregarding his wife's fierce glare. Jimin asked Taeyong if he was his biological father. Looking at Jimin's eager eyes, Taeyong finally admitted it in front of his son. He embraced his son tightly. He had waited 12 long years to reunite with his son. Taeyong then brought Jimin inside the house. Jimin politely greeted his family. Although Rona's heart was filled with resentment, but in order to maintain her marriage with her husband, she had to pretend to care deeply about Jimin. She told her husband that she would raise Jimin well. Taeyong looked at his wife's hypocritical expression. He knew that it was his wife who had spread the truth about his son's origins. Now he also harbored a hint of hatred toward his wife. Taeyong urged his son to understand his mother. She had done it all for his sake. Early the next morning, Siu waited anxiously at the front door for her son. She noticed that her son was deliberately avoiding her. At that moment, Rona deliberately walked by. She thoughtfully prepared lunch for Jimin and reminded him to be careful on his way to school. However, as soon as Jimin left, she instantly changed her expression. She said that Jimin didn't want to see her now. She mocked Siwoo, saying that if he had any sense of shame, he should not show his face to Jimin anymore. After saying that, she left. After school, Jimin saw his adoptive father at the front door. Kuanhu also apologized to Jimin. He wanted Jimin to go home with him. However, Rona appeared again. She told Jimin that she had made sweet potato cake and urged him to hurry home. Kuanhu watched his son's departing figure with reluctance. Upon returning home, he began to suspect his wife. He felt that she had colluded with Taeyong with the intention of taking Jimin away. He confronted his wife, asking if she had revealed the truth about their identity swap. However, Siwoo denied it. She also reminded her husband not to let his mother find out about this secret. Hearing his wife say this, Kuanhu finally let go of his suspicions. Little did he know that his mother and wife had immediately gone to meet Taeyong. Taeyong urged his mother not to expose Taejun and his son's crimes, because he had nearly died twice at Taechun's hands. If Taejun found out that he had been exposed, Jimin and her grandfather would be in danger. After hearing her son's words, Junhee could only agree. After her mother left, Taeyong looked at the woman he deeply loved. He said he would try his best to persuade Jimin. Once he had avenged himself, the three of them would be happy together again. Soon after, Taeyong obtained the recording proving that Taejun had swapped the children. He swore to take back everything that rightfully belonged to him. He then sent the recording to Suki's home. Upon hearing the contents of the recording, everyone was deeply shocked. Suki believed her sister was unaware of this. Her son Min-jae wanted to inform his aunt about this matter as soon as possible and expel his uncle and Kuanhu from the house. The cunning father told Suki to remain calm. He said now was not the optimal time to reveal this matter. Their top priority now was to protect his father-in-law's safety. Once his father-in-law regained consciousness, they would reveal the truth. His father-in-law would certainly make Min-jae the heir to the family. Suki then dispatched a large number of bodyguards to the hospital. Min-jae also went to find Taeyong. Because he knew Taeyong held a significant stake in Yangdi Group, he wanted to collaborate with Taeyong to oust his uncle from power. At that moment, he had no idea that his entire family was merely a pawn in Taeyong's revenge plan. Soon, Taejun noticed something amiss. He wondered why his brother-in-law's family had suddenly rushed to the hospital. He then bribed the hospital doctors. The doctors secretly installed listening devices in the room. Taejun immediately understood the reason behind everything. It turned out that they had discovered the secret he had hidden for years, and his secret was stored on a USB drive. He planned to get his hands on the USB drive at all costs. He couldn't let these people hold such leverage over him. He ordered his secretary to find the USB drive immediately. The bribed doctor returned to the ward shortly after. They hadn't expected the USB drive to be so easy to obtain. When Taejun heard the contents of the drive, he broke out in a cold sweat. He never imagined it would be a recording of his conversation with Miran. To eliminate any future threats, he had to make sure Kuanhu inherited the company as soon as possible. He then went home to discuss it with his wife. However, he didn't know that his wife had already found out that Kuanhu wasn't his biological child. She was merely cooperating with Taeyong's revenge plan. What was even more tragic was that his son, Kuanhu, had also heard the recording on the USB drive. Now Kuanhu knew that Miran was his biological mother. That day, Rona prepared a sumptuous breakfast for Jimin. When she heard that Jimin wanted to eat his biological mother's cooking, she instantly became unhappy. She harshly scolded Jimin. She forbade Jimin from ever mentioning his mother in front of her again. However, all of this was witnessed by Taeyong. He finally saw his wife's ugly true colors. He hurriedly comforted his frightened son. He then called his wife into the next room. He said that his son had already suffered too much in recent times. He confronted his wife about why she was treating their son this way. At this point, Rona didn't think much of it. She said she was just trying to correct Jimin's picky-eating habits. Upon hearing his wife's words, Taeyong became furious. He said that his son didn't need her to worry about him anymore. Seeing this, Rona threatened Taeyong to treat her better in the future. If her husband angered her, she would take it out on Jimin. After saying that, she left angrily. For the sake of his son, Taeyong had already decided to divorce his wife. The next day, he took his son to the park for a walk. In reality, he was taking his son to meet his biological mother. Taeyong tried to persuade his son. He wanted to clear up the misunderstanding between his son and Siwoo. Jimin also understood his father, so he asked the two of them what their plans were for the future. He didn't want to live like this anymore. Both of them wanted to live happily together with their son. But right now, Taeyong had to complete his revenge plan first. The next day, he went to the hospital to visit his grandfather, who was still in a coma. He swore that he would expose Taechun's crimes. However, the next day, the news reported that someone had impersonated Taeyong. All of this was done by Kuanhu. At that moment, he was watching the news with a smug look on his face. A large group of reporters immediately gathered outside Taeyong's house. To protect his son from being disturbed, he had no choice but to send his son to Siwoo's house first. The board of directors of the Taeyong investment group, which he had founded with his own hands, had decided to dismiss him. Taeyong then called Siwoo and asked him to meet him at the beach. He told Siwoo that he wanted to restore Yuchel's identity. He wanted to go back to the past and start over with Siwoo. Siwoo agreed with his idea. The two embraced each other tightly. Later, Taeyong found Rona and wanted to divorce her. However, Rona refused no matter what. Taeyong said he had regained his former identity. The man who married her was Taeyong. The name on his ID card was now Yuchel. Upon hearing her husband's words, Rona slapped him across the face. Taeyong said that as long as his wife agreed to divorce, he would give her all his assets. Rona couldn't understand why her husband was being so cruel to her. She didn't know that all of this was because of her mother. Her husband was originally the eldest son of a wealthy family. It was Miran who used her own son to steal her husband's life. Miran also knew that she had committed a grave sin. She urged Rona not to continue this entanglement. However, Rona insisted she wouldn't give up. She then went to find Siwoo. Siwoo hoped Rona wouldn't cause him any more trouble. He believed Rona had mental issues. Rona swore she wouldn't let them be together no matter what. After saying that, she left angrily. At that moment, Yuchel began his own revenge plan. He had already purchased a large stake in Yangdi Group. He planned to convene a shareholders meeting. Only by controlling the board of directors of Yangdi Group could he drive Taejun out of Yangdi Group. Jung-hee would definitely support her son. Yuchel then told the other shareholder of Yangdi, Mr. Huang, about this. Over the years, Mr. Huang had also treated Yuchel like his own son. After hearing Yuchel's plan, he readily agreed. Suk-hee's family also wanted to oust Taejun. She hoped her sister would stand by her side at the shareholders meeting, so she approached Jung-hee and revealed that Kuanhu was not her biological son. At that moment, she was unaware that Jung-hee had already known about this. However, what neither of them anticipated was that Taejun had already stationed people to monitor Jung-hee. Their conversation quickly reached Taechun's ears. He was extremely anxious. He couldn't let the shareholders meeting go smoothly. He didn't want all his hard work over the years to be taken away by Yuchel. In order to break up Kuanhu's family, Jung-hee arranged a blind date for his son. The woman said she didn't care about his past. She said she had wanted to be with Kuanhu since she was in school. Faced with the woman's confession, Kuanhu was very reluctant. After returning home, he confronted his mother. However, he didn't know that his mother already knew his true identity. Although Kuanhu wasn't her biological son, after decades of living together, they had developed feelings for each other. She urged Kuanhu to find a woman who truly loved him and start a new life. However, Kuanhu was willing to be with Siwoo, even if they couldn't have children. He didn't care. Jung-hee once again urged her son to meet the woman a few more times. If he still didn't want to by then, she would never force him. After hearing his mother's words, Kuanhu reluctantly agreed. After his mother left, Kuanhu suddenly realized that his mother had known all along that he wasn't her biological son. Kuanhu felt deeply guilty. However, Taejun didn't think the same way. Now that Jung-hee knows that Yuchel is her biological son, he absolutely cannot let Yangdi Group be taken over by Yuchel. So the next day, he found Kuanhu. He said that the truth about him switching the babies had been exposed. If the shareholders meeting goes smoothly, not only will the two of them be ruthlessly kicked out of the house, but they will also face legal consequences. That night, Taejun handed his son a white medicine bottle and told him to give it to his biological mother. Kuanhu then arranged to meet his biological mother and handed over the bottle as his father had instructed. He said it was sleeping pills and that they must be given to Mr. Huang on the morning of the shareholders meeting. However, Miran, who still had a shred of conscience, refused. She said she was prepared to accept the punishment. Seeing her mother so resolute, Kuanhu could only plead with his mother in tears. He said that it was they who had switched the children. Why should he have to bear the legal consequences as well? He begged his mother to help him one last time. As long as Mr. Huang took the sleeping pills, at least his mother could help him buy some time to escape. Hearing her son's words, Miran reluctantly agreed. On the day of the shareholders meeting, Miran added the sleeping pills to the soup that Mr. Huang loved most. However, Mr. Huang was completely unaware. He took the bowl from Miran and drank it all in one gulp. He even praised Miran's cooking skills enthusiastically. Miran silently apologized to him in her heart. She thought she had added sleeping pills to Mr. Huan's soup. She only hoped that Mr. Huan would sleep peacefully at home for a day. However, to her surprise, Mr. Huan soon began showing symptoms of a heart attack and had already stopped breathing by the time he arrived at the hospital. Soon, Miran also learned of Mr. Huan's death. This was an immense blow to her. She lay in bed for 3 days without eating. She didn't even attend Mr. Huan's funeral. Recalling the medication her son had given her, Kuanhu had clearly said it was sleeping pills. Now she began to suspect the contents of the bottle. She hurried to the pharmacy. The clerk told her that it was a drug that could easily cause a heart attack due to its strong side effects. It had been discontinued long ago. She knew that Mr. Huan's death must be related to her son. Meanwhile, Kuanhu was also extremely anxious. He recalled what his father had told him. He must never reveal that his mother had given the medicine to Mr. Huan. Heartbroken, Miran arranged to meet her son. Kuanhu pretended to be innocent. He asked his mother why she had called him out. Miran looked at her son. She knew this matter was related to him, but she couldn't send her own son to prison. She urged Kuanhu to return what didn't belong to him. After saying that, Miran left silently. At that moment, Taejoon had achieved his goal. He wanted his wife to treat Kuanhu like her own son. He also urged her to give up on treating her father. Junhee was stunned. She said she would never forgive Taejoon. Taejoon felt that his day had finally come. His son could now inherit Yangdi Group with peace of mind. However, what he didn't expect was that his unconscious father-in-law had regained consciousness. On the other side, after Mr. Huang's death, Yuchel suddenly received a huge inheritance. The cash alone amounted to 3 trillion won. Miran also received a large shopping mall. There was also a 10-story building in Seoul's wealthy district. Yuchel had no idea that Mr. Huang had so much assets. He also had no idea why he left the money to him. It turned out that Mr. Huang had long harbored feelings for Miran. He left the money to Yuchel to help Miran atone for her sins. After hearing the will, Miran was heartbroken because only she knew the true cause of Mr. Huang's death. She knew she had committed an unforgivable crime, so she urged her daughter to divorce Yuchel and revealed the truth about how she had secretly swapped Yuchel years ago. Upon learning that her husband was Woljin's biological grandson, Roma was utterly shocked. However, she did not want to leave her husband. She could not understand why she had to bear the consequences of her mother's mistakes. She told her husband that the 3 trillion won left by Mr. Huang was meant to atone for her mother's sins. She urged Yuchel not to harbor any resentment. Yuchel noticed that his wife was acting unusually. He sensed that she might be suffering from mental issues. Now was not the time to confront her. Yuchel not only inherited Mr. Huang's cash assets, but also his shares in Yangdi Group. He decided to apply again to convene a shareholders meeting to expel Taejoon from the company. Before Mr. Huang passed away, he visited Woljin in the hospital. He told Woljin about Miran swapping his grandson. He also hoped Woljin would forgive Miran. In fact, Woljin had already regained his senses by then. He had already discovered that Yuchel was his true grandson. He feared his son-in-law might harm him, so he pretended to have dementia. Taejoon knew his father-in-law was no longer a threat. Yangdi Group would certainly be inherited by his son. However, Kuanhu was deeply resentful toward him. He knew Mr. Huan's death was undoubtedly connected to his father. He blamed his father for making him give the poison to his mother. Unexpectedly, their conversation was overheard by Woljin. Taejoon comforted him, telling him not to worry. However, the next day, Woljin found his daughter and revealed everything he knew. Siu hurriedly found Yuchel and told him to investigate the true cause of Mr. Huan's death. After learning the truth, Yuchel confronted his mother-in-law. Miran no longer hid the truth. She handed the medicine Taejoon had given her to her son-in-law. That night, Rona dreamed that her deceased daughter had returned to find her. Seeing her daughter leave, she ran out barefoot. She feared her daughter would leave her again. The daughter silently ran to Siwoo's front door and pointed her finger towards Siwoo's house. At that moment, Miran also realized her daughter was not at home. When she rushed out the door, she saw her daughter standing at the neighbor's door. Rona told her mother that her granddaughter's death was all Siwoo's fault. She swore that she would never let her husband be with Siwoo. Miran noticed that her daughter was acting strangely. The next day, she took her daughter to the hospital. However, Miran didn't know that Rona had already bribed the doctor. The doctor said that Rona didn't have any mental illness. Instead, Miran should pay more attention to her health. Upon learning that his mother-in-law and wife had gone to the hospital, Yuchel finally felt at ease. However, what he didn't expect was that Rona not only had mental issues, but she also blamed Siwoo for her daughter's death. Siwoo didn't want to deal with the crazy woman in front of him. Her top priority now was to find evidence of Taechun's crimes. However, Taejun was becoming increasingly arrogant. Not only does he show no remorse, but he also shifts all the blame onto his wife. However, their conversation is overheard by Woljin outside the door. Taejun is unaware that his father-in-law has heard what he just said. Woljin is shocked by his son-in-law's cruelty. He calls the butler and orders him to prepare a meal and poison wine. He decides to take Taejun with him in death. However, Taejun is completely unaware of this. When he raised the cup to drink it all in one gulp, his wife suddenly walked into the room. He said he was in a bad mood and wanted his wife to drink it for him. Woljin saw this and hurriedly stopped his daughter. Seeing his father-in-law's anxious expression, Taejun immediately grew suspicious. To prove his suspicions, he once again held the cup in front of his wife. Woljin once again scolded his daughter harshly and told her to get out immediately. Taejun, who had seen through everything, finally stopped pretending. He said he had lived his entire life like a servant. He confronted his father-in-law, asking why he wanted to poison him. Woljin, whose scheme had been exposed, no longer bothered to pretend. He said he wanted to see his son-in-law go to hell with his own eyes. After leaving his father-in-law's room, Taejun hurriedly found Kuanhu. He said Woljin did not have dementia. He knew everything his father and Woljin had done. Siwoo was also investigating the cause of Mr. Huang's death. The truth about Mr. Huang's poisoning might soon come to light. Kuanhu told his father not to worry. He said he would protect him. The next day, he bribed a reporter to spread the news that Yuchel had murdered Mr. Huang. He swore he would send Yuchel to prison. Kuanhu then found his mother again. He placed the medicine in front of her and told her to poison Yuchel. Miran refused. Seeing her mother's resolute expression, Kuanhu pleaded with her again. If this matter is exposed, the three of them will definitely be arrested. Seeing her son's pitiful state, Miran could only silently agree. After returning home, Kuanhu arrogantly told his wife that he was the one who spread the news about Yuchel's murder. Siwoo couldn't believe her husband had become like this. Junhee was also very angry with him. She believed that it was all Miran's fault, so she rushed to Yuchel's house in a rage. She hoped that Miran would tell the truth and clear Yuchel's name. However, Miran recalled Kuanhu's pitiful appearance that day. She couldn't send her son to prison, so she kept apologizing. Rona, who knew nothing about it, wanted to stand up for her mother. Seeing her daughter-in-law's arrogant attitude, Junhee had no choice but to reveal that Miran had drugged Mr. Huang. At that moment, Yuchel also returned home. Junhee was worried that Yuchel would be killed by these two evil women. She struggled to pull Yuchel out of the house. However, the scene of the three of them together was seen by Kuanhu. He was filled with jealousy. The next day, he bribed a cleaner. The cleaner placed a white medicine bottle in Yuchel's office. Kuanhu believed that this time, Yuchel would not escape punishment. Soon, Yuchel was arrested on suspicion of murder. Faced with the relentless questioning of the reporters, he said nothing. He believed that his mother-in-law and wife would clear his name. However, when questioned by the police, Miran also said nothing, because the murderer of Mr. Huang was her lover. Taejun, Rona also did not tell the police the truth to protect her mother. The police found a bottle of medicine in Yuchel's office. Yuchel was facing decades in prison. Upon learning that her son had been arrested, Junhee was frantic. She rushed to find Miran to save Yuchel. Seeing that Miran remained unmoved, Junhee knelt before her. She said that as long as Miran was willing to tell the truth, she would agree to anything. However, in the face of Junhee's desperate pleas, Miran coldly walked away. At that moment, she was also filled with doubt. She recalled the words her son-in-law had said to her. She had done so many wrong things to Yuchel, yet Yuchel had forgiven her. Thus, she finally made up her mind to reveal the truth. She then dialed Taechun's phone. Upon meeting him, she confronted Taejun about why he had given her the medication. Why did he have to let an innocent person lose their life? Taejun said that Mr. Huang knew about the secret baby swap between him and her. Now Mr. Huang is dead. As long as she doesn't tell the police the truth, everything will be framed on Yuchel. Their son will become the heir to Yangdi Group. Taejun didn't know that his words had been recorded by Miran. Miran then arranged to meet Kuanhu. She told him that he had never given her any medicine. Huang's death had nothing to do with him. She urged her son to behave himself in the future. Kuanhu was confused by his mother's words. What he didn't expect was that his mother had already sent the recording and a handwritten letter to Siwoo. After reading the contents of the letter, Siwoo handed over the evidence to the police. After being detained for several days, Yuchel was finally exonerated. At the same time, Taejun learned that the police were preparing to arrest him. With his secretary's help, he escaped. Kuanhu also saw the news on TV. He finally realized that his mother had done everything to protect him. As Taechun's crimes were exposed, Yuchel finally regained his true identity. He wanted to meet his grandfather and mother. The family members were all happy and introduced themselves to Yuchel. His mother kept holding on to her son's arm. She was afraid that she might accidentally lose him again. The family members all believed that Kuanhu, who had exposed his identity, would have no face to stand day at home, Kuanhu received a call from his father. At that moment, Taejun said that although his identity had been exposed, Junhee had developed feelings for him. He urged his son to continue living in that house. After hearing his father's words, Kuanhu swore that he would reclaim everything he had lost. The next day, he appeared at the dinner table again. Yuchel, who had rushed over, was shocked to see Kuanhu acting so shamelessly. Woljin rearranged the seating at the table. He ordered Yuchel to change his surname back to the original one as soon as possible, and take over the position of chairman of Yangdi Group. This made Kuanhu extremely jealous. He recalled the words his grandfather had once told him. His heart had become utterly twisted. Yuchel had not only taken away his position as chairman, but also his mother's love for him. Seeds of hatred began to grow in his heart. What was even more tragic was that his grandfather wanted him to leave the family. He hoped Kuanhu would divorce his wife as soon as possible. However, Kuanhu refused to agree. He said that Yuchel had already taken everything from him. He couldn't let his son be taken away by Yuchel either. He recalled the words his father had once said to him. He would never leave this family. At that moment, Taejun also learned that Yuchel was about to become chairman. He handed a USB drive to his secretary and instructed her to deliver it personally to Kuanhu. Soon, Kuanhu heard the contents of the USB drive. He rushed to Yuchel's office. The USB drive contained a recording of his grandfather instructing Taejun to kill Yuchel. Kuanhu demanded that Yuchel hand over the position of chairman to him. Otherwise, he would use the recording to have his grandfather arrested. Yuchel knew this was all part of Taechun's scheme. He instructed his colleagues to have someone follow Kuanhu. He believed that Kuanhu must be connected to Taejun. At that moment, Kuanhu arrived at the chairman's office. He swore that he would do whatever it took to take the chairman's position. However, what he didn't expect was that his threat to Yuchel was overheard by Rona. Rona also came to Woljin's house. She revealed Kuanhu's plan to expose his grandfather. Yuchel was worried about his grandfather, so he decided to compromise with Kuanhu. However, to his surprise, his grandfather had already gone to the police station on his own. He confessed his crimes to the police. Since Kuanhu had turned himself involuntarily and had a history of heart problems, the police immediately approved his request for medical parole. He instructed his two daughters to hold a grand inauguration ceremony for his grandson. At this point, Kuanhu's plan was once again shattered, but he was not willing to give up. A few days later, Yuchel attended the chairman's inauguration ceremony. He recalled the scene from 10 years ago. Back then, he had been stopped by security guards because of his plain attire. Now, however, he was welcomed by everyone. Yuchel greeted everyone. He was kind and approachable to every employee. He decided to reform Yangdi Group and eliminate the bad habits that had been left behind in the company. Soon, he discovered problems in the company's financial statements. Kuanhu's Yangdi Logistics had been using fake accounts to beautify the company's financial reports in order to gain greater profits, so he called Kuanhu to his office. Yuchel said he would give Kuanhu a chance to voluntarily give up his position as vice chairman. However, Kuanhu refused to agree. He had already lost his position as chairman of the company. He couldn't let Yuchel take away Yangdi Logistics, which his father had founded with his own hands. So he went to his grandfather and knelt before him, begging for forgiveness. He said that last time he had only intended to threaten Yuchel and had no real intention of reporting his grandfather. However, his true intentions had already been seen through by Woljin. He ordered Kuanhu to divorce Siwoo and return Jimin's custody to Yuchel. However, Kuanhu felt that he had done nothing wrong. He refused to agree to the divorce. Soon, the company's shareholders decided to dismiss Kuanhu. At this point, Kuanhu had lost everything. He said his final goodbyes to his wife. Then he went alone to the mountain villa. His wife also noticed that something was wrong with Kuanhu, so she called Yuchel to come over. The terrifying scene was witnessed by Yuchel. Kuanhu picked up the hunting rifle nearby and aimed it at himself. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, he heard Yuchel's voice. Kuanhu couldn't understand why Yuchel was there. Yuchel tried to persuade Kuanhu. Kuanhu slowly stood up. He said that he and Yuchel were born on the same day, but their fates were completely different. It was because of Yuchel that he lost everything. He then aimed the gun at Yuchel with malice. Kuanhu's sudden change caught Yuchel off guard. However, when he tried to pull the trigger again, Siwoo immediately stood in front of Yuchel. Kuanhu saw how much his wife cared about Yuchel and fired the gun in anger. Siwoo fell to the ground. Yuchel rushed Siwoo to the hospital and waited anxiously outside the operating room. He didn't want Siwoo to die. At that moment, Kuanhu also arrived at the hospital. He was filled with regret. Fortunately, after the doctor's desperate efforts, Siwoo's life was saved. Yuchel finally relaxed. Kuanhu cried as he dialed his father's number. He confessed that he had shot someone. Taejun told his son to flee abroad before the police came looking for him. He said they would live abroad from now on. Meanwhile, Siwoo had regained consciousness. She begged Yuchel to tell the police it was an accident when they questioned him. She didn't want Kuanhu to be sent to prison. Looking at Siwoo, who had just regained consciousness, Yuchel reluctantly agreed. At that moment, Kuanhu, desperate to escape abroad, called Rona. He asked Rona to go to his house and helped him steal his passport. However, Rona was discovered by Yuchel as soon as she obtained the passport. In her mentally unstable state, Rona immediately betrayed Kuanhu. The next morning, Yuchel called Kuanhu. Since Kuanhu's passport was in his possession, Kuanhu had no choice but to meet with Yuchel. After they met, Yuchel told him that the police weren't looking for him. He and Siu had told the police it was just an accident. Hearing Yuchel's words, Kuanhu felt deeply guilty. He then went to the hospital to visit Siu. Siu saw Kuanhu and didn't say anything. She gave Kuanhu her passport and told him he could go wherever he wanted. She also sincerely apologized to her husband. She said that everything was her fault. Seeing this, Kuanhu forgave Siu. After leaving the hospital, Kuanhu thought back to what his mother had said to him. He couldn't become like his father and be despised by everyone. He then went straight to the police station. Meanwhile, Taejoon arrived at a restaurant. He wanted to eat his hometown food one last time before going abroad. However, he didn't know that a familiar figure had appeared in the kitchen. He ate his meal heartily. For some reason, the taste felt strangely familiar. Miran suddenly appeared and told him that she had made the food. Taejoon said she ruined his life and his son's life. However, Miran mocked him, saying he was about to die and still didn't know it. Hearing Miran's words, Taejoon fiercely grabbed her neck, intending to kill her. However, Miran had already poisoned the food. Soon, Taejoon fainted. When he regained consciousness, he saw Yuchel beside him. He shamelessly said that Yuchel should be grateful to him. He said it was he who had created suffering and trials for Yuchel. Without him, Yuchel would never have achieved what he had today. Yuchel was completely speechless at Taechun's ugly face. Taejoon took advantage of Yuchel's distraction, pushed him aside, and ran out. However, when he stepped outside, he saw a large number of police officers waiting for him. He was then taken to the police station. At that moment, Taejoon had no idea that he was about to face an even greater blow. He never expected that Kuanhu had also been arrested. He angrily demanded to know why his son was there. Kuanhu said he had turned himself in. He didn't want to live like his father, despised by everyone. At this moment, Yuchel had finally gotten his revenge. He wanted to start a new life with Siwoo. However, he and Siwoo became the topic of gossip. Jimin was also bullied at school because of this incident. Yuchel had no choice but to send Siwoo and his son abroad. Now, Rona's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. Seeing this, Yuchel was very hesitant. He recalled scenes from his daughter's life before she passed away. Since his daughter left, his wife has developed mental health issues. Although he once harbored resentment toward his mother-in-law and wife, he has finally let go of his grievances. His mother-in-law says she will send Rona to the hospital for treatment. She also knows that her entire family has wronged Yuchel. After being released from the hospital, Siwoo visits Kuanhu in prison. She tells Kuanhu about her plan to take Jimin abroad. At that moment, Kuanhu finally realized his mistakes. He decided to reform himself and start anew. He said he would forget Siwoo and urge her to take good care of Jimin. 3 years passed quickly. Yuchel had successfully managed the company. He decided to resign from his position as chairman. The company was handed over to professional managers. Siwoo returned from abroad with her son. Because Woljin had been given several critical condition notices, Siwoo brought Jimin back to bid farewell to his grandfather. The rest of the family also rushed to the hospital. Woljin had no regrets at this point. He passed away peacefully under the watchful eyes of his family. At this time, Kuanhu had already completed his sentence. He learned of his grandfather's passing from his mother. Accompanying his mother to pick up Kuanhu was his former matchmaker. It turned out that the woman had been waiting for Kuanhu's release for the past 3 years. Meanwhile, Rona had also recovered and been discharged from the hospital. With Yuchel's support, she opened a restaurant. She also found new love. It turned out that a male colleague had been secretly in love with her all along. 15 years ago, they had met at this very cafe. Kuanhu visited his father in prison. Although Taejoon still had decades left on his sentence, he still shows no remorse. Kuanhu is completely speechless toward his father. He then goes to visit his adoptive mother. She explains that she was busy with his father's funeral and couldn't attend Kuanhu's release. She has prepared a new house for Kuanhu. At this moment, Kuanhu is deeply grateful. As he leaves, he sees Siwoo. The two have also come to terms with their past. They agreed to meet regularly as friends in the future. Yuchel had already resigned from his position as chairman. He had built a new villa in a scenic area with his own hands. He promised to hold a grand wedding for Siwoo. The film ends here. If you're interested, please like and follow us. See you next time.